I am here today to talk about the policies and actions of the United States and its local allies in the Middle East and how some policy changes may improve their relations. Back in 2011, I was interested in the Egyptian Revolution which overthrew the current president at the time, Hosni Mubarak. There seemed to be a fundamental flaw in the Egyptian government's policies and actions which led to massive protests in Egypt and a change in government. It was clear that the Egyptian people felt that they had been treated unjustly by Mubarak's government, and so were taking to the streets to let their grievances be known. But how do we discern what is truly just and unjust? In short, what is a global definition of justice? It is clear that with all the political issues not only in the Middle East but around the world, that an answer to this difficult question is not only necessary, but a requirement to make progress in solving human rights issues. Yet, there are so many philosophies and doctrines which expound upon what is right and wrong, just and unjust. There must be an answer which can both simplify and also clarify this tough question. Due to the revolution in 2011, Egypt is currently undergoing a fundamental change which will shape its future political, social, and economic policy. Is there some philosophy or idea that we can apply to create policy which could have prevented the 2011 revolution and prevented the horrific events in Egypt by establishing a definition of global justice? I believe that the philosopher John Rawls has the answer that the world seeks. In this presentation, I will take John Rawls' ideas found in his book Political Liberalism and use them to create and inform a set of rules to define global justice. For the idea of global justice to be truly effective, it cannot only be a philosophical idea. There must also be a physical document which would allow for the practical application of global justice. But what document will allow us to accomplish this? In the presentation, I use both the United States and Egyptian constitutions and compare them to John Rawls' ideas of global justice to see if they can be applied as a roadmap for global justice and inform future international policy. By using these documents, it becomes clear that there have been points where governments have been unjust and as a consequence were overthrown through revolutions. A revolution which fundamentally affected the United States policy in the Middle East was the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Did the Iranian Revolution happen because the current government at the time overstepped the boundaries of global justice? There were actions taken by the Shah's government which were in flagrant disregard of inherent human rights. With the flagrant disregard of human rights, did Iran's revolution set a precedent for future revolutions? There are certain similarities between both the Iranian Revolution and the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Taking note of these similarities may inform future policy in the Middle East and provide a warning system against future revolutions. But the final question is, taking this all into account, how can we prevent these future revolutions? Revolutions do not only affect a country's political, social, and economic structure, but the world's political, social, and economic structure as well. Through specific policy, I believe that we can avoid these shocks to the global system caused by revolutions. We begin our journey with Rawls. In his book Political Liberalism, Rawls poses a question which, upon further consideration, lays out the rules for global justice in the question. What is the most appropriate conception of justice for specifying the fair terms of social cooperation between citizens, regarded as free and equal and as fully cooperating members over a complete life from one generation to the next? There are two key sections in that question which Rawls later goes on to expound upon. Rawls believes that citizens must be free and equal. Now, freedom itself can be interpreted quite broadly, but in this case, it is the fact that people must be free to choose what they believe in. If a government enforces a particular doctrine or idea that some people don't believe in, then there is nothing to prevent them from disregarding it in their day-to-day lives. In that same sentence, Rawls also requires that citizens must be considered equal. Equal, again, has a rather broad interpretation, so to be clear, Rawls states that the citizens must be equal in the eyes of the law. If a country defines a group as being lower class, then that group will inherently fight for its rights in both peaceful and violent means. Rawls makes one final point in the second portion of the quote. He makes it clear that the definition of global justice must be applicable at any point in time. If laws are not consistently reconsidered and updated, then they become ineffective and meaningless. Most countries and people adhere to the ideals, doctrines, and beliefs from a series of religious groups. Yet, If the government were to adhere to a single religious group's beliefs, then it would alienate a major portion of its population. As evidenced in the graph created by the Pew Research Center in December 2012, a country whose religious groups break down in a similar fashion would be alienating more than two-thirds of its citizens if it followed Christian ideals, even though Christianity was the largest religious group. For this reason, Rawls believes that religious doctrine or moral philosophies cannot dictate government policy. According to Rawls, the political culture of a democratic society is always marked by a diversity of opposing and irreconcilable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines. This is known as Rawls' fact of reasonable pluralism. Inherent in every democratic country is the fact that there is a plurality of ideas. If we were to break from this rule and enforce a single vein of ideas, then citizens would no longer be free to believe in what they want. There are countless historical examples of moments where countries have tied their policy to religious and moral doctrines which have led to major violations of justice and basic human rights. Rawls was not the only one to question the application of religious beliefs in defining government laws and policy. Cornel West also argued that having religion dictate laws deploys claims of religious faith that can never be settled by appeals to reason. An inherent part of coming to any decision in a democratic society is the debate between opposing viewpoints and the final compromise, which brings these two ideas together and moves people forward. Yet, if we apply religious doctrine to this debate, then there is no possible way to have an objective debate. The reason being is that religion in its essence is philosophical. It cannot be quantified through the realm of data. This means that no person is truly right or wrong in a debate, thus no true direction or agreement can be ascertained. The same thing applies in the case of moral doctrines and ideas. People inherently have different ideas and beliefs that do not always adhere to current policy. Yet if a person were to fundamentally believe these ideas, why should they disregard them? These are fundamental ideas that a person may have built their life around, and thus there should be no reason to set them aside. Yet when a person is chosen for a jury in the United States, that is exactly what they must do. They must rely only on what is provided in terms of evidence and sworn statements. If a person is unable to do this, then they are basing their judgment on feelings and not the facts presented before them. For this reason, Rawls feels that moral doctrines, beliefs, and ideas should be set aside as well when creating laws and government policy. It should be noted, however, that Rawls does realize that social and economic inequalities are an inherent part of society. It is nearly an impossible task to make everyone equal, and no government should attempt to do so. Every inequality, according to Rawls, must clear two hurdles. Any high social position must be open to all citizens, and any economic inequality must be of greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. Yet this seems to be in contradiction to his previous statements that citizens must be free and equal by giving preference to the least advantaged members of society. Now that we have an understanding of what global justice means and the rules for which it is bound by, we can apply it to a document which will let us employ global justice in practical terms. With all the major events happening in Egypt, it seems as if there was no guiding document to enforce laws. However, during Morsi's time as president, there was a constitution which detailed rules and laws for which Egypt had to abide by. But do these laws abide by Rawls' rules of global justice? As evidenced by these three articles, the Egyptian constitution adhered to most of Rawls' principles but one. As shown in Article 2 of the Constitution, Egypt indicates that Islam is the religion of the state, which is in conflict with Rawls' belief that religion and state should be separate. Without a doubt, people who practice Islam are in the clear majority in Egypt, but this does not take into account the other religions present in Egypt. In addition, Article 2 seems to challenge the principles laid out in Articles 7 and 13, and possibly contradict them through its reliance on Islamic law. This draws into question how useful the Egyptian constitution is in implying global justice. It seems that over the past decade, the United States has taken on the role of a global police force. But does the United States Constitution uphold Rawls' belief in global justice? The United States Constitution is a constantly evolving piece of writing, and although not a perfect document when it was first created, was constantly amended to work towards a more perfect democracy. So according to these three amendments to the United States Constitution, it would appear that the amended Constitution more closely follows Rawls' belief in political liberalism, and by extension global justice. There is a clear delineation between religion and the state, and people are guaranteed to have their basic rights without exception. Using the United States Constitution as a way to analyze the actions of governments within the Middle East, we can now analyze whether their actions were truly just and if they may have led to revolution. People may argue that the United States and countries within the Middle East are very different politically and economically and thus cannot be judged by the United States Constitution. However, I am instead suggesting that the United States should reevaluate its Middle Eastern allies based on the Constitution's ideals which it believes in so fundamentally. The United States cannot say that it truly believes in its Constitution if it lets its allies violate fundamental rights while the United States turns a blind eye. If there are certain cultural aspects that cannot be overcome, then they must be acknowledged and a common ground found where both countries reach a mutual understanding. One country where this did not happen and whose revolution fundamentally changed the United States Middle Eastern policy was Iran. Iran was once an ally of the United States after the overthrow of Mossadegh. Yet the actions of the Shah's government and its attempts to create a Western capitalist society led to a massive inflation and a large wealth gap which alienated the lower class. The Shah attempted to bring this under control through his White Revolution, which focused on reforming education and the school system as well as land reform. However, some of his actions violate the rules of global justice as laid out by John Rawls and the United States Constitution, with which we are using for the practical application of global justice. Politically, the Shah created the Resurgence political party and forced all Iranians to join and pay dues while banning all other political parties. This action goes against Rawls' belief that people should be free to choose what they believe in, and it is inconsistent with the United States First Amendment to the Constitution in the sense that it does not allow people to peacefully assemble. Due to the increasing inflation, the Shah also began to arrest and fine merchants for the high prices they were forced to charge to make a profit. These actions go against Rawls' belief that all citizens should be treated equal. In addition, it is irreconcilable with the U.S. Constitution's Fourth Amendment, which says that people should be safe against unreasonable search and seizure, which the Shah disregarded when he arrested the merchants simply because they were trying to make a profit. All the actions of the Shah were in interest of creating a society filled with more Western cultural ideas, which alienated the religious and conservative portions of Iran and led to a revolution against the Shah and his eventual overthrow. Keeping in mind the actions taken by the Shah's government and the results, we can now look at the Egyptian Revolution and draw parallels. This will indicate whether there are certain government actions which we can say with high certainty will lead to revolution, and with a change in policy may prevent these revolutions from happening. Egypt, prior to 2011, was a well-known U.S. ally in the Middle East. However, with the Egyptian economy facing tough challenges and facing numerous issues within the political system, huge protests were organized through social media, and the president at the time, Hosni Mubarak, was eventually overthrown. The Egyptian government repeated some of the same actions that had happened during the Iranian Revolution. They controlled newspapers and tried to make Egypt a capitalist economy while suppressing political groups that spoke out against Mubarak. Some people believe that these protests were started by the Muslim Brotherhood in attempts to take over the government. They believe that there is a connection between the violence and extremism advocated by the Muslim Brotherhood and the economic conditions in which people find themselves. However, there has been no connection between poverty and the propensity to embrace violence and extremism. Mubarak was a very politically astute individual and realized that people resented the previous president, Anwar Sadat, because he had prevented other political parties from operating. Mubarak reversed this decision and allowed them to meet, with the major exception being the Muslim Brotherhood. This spoke to the fact that the Egyptian democracy was not a true democracy. The actions of the Egyptian government go against Rawls's idea that all citizens should be treated equally without regard to their beliefs, and it also does not work with the U.S. Constitution's Ninth Amendment because it targets a specific portion of the population and denies them basic rights afforded to other people. In the economic sector, the government was focused on investing in businesses that had low labor absorption but high capital output. This led to massive unemployment and lowered incomes greatly both in the city and rural areas. Even though incomes were falling, the Egyptian government increased prices in basic necessities. This created a country that was focused primarily on special interest groups who were focused on making a profit. The actions of the government do not violate a specific portion of Rawls' beliefs, however, they do not benefit the least advantaged, and so they become an unfair economic advantage. The Egyptian government under Hosni Mubarak was also allowed to control the publishing of opposition newspapers. The opposition newspapers were allowed to publish, but if they went beyond the bounds allowed by the government, they could easily be suspended. This goes against Rawls' idea that a person should be free to believe in what they want because the government is controlling the flow of information, and it abridges the freedom of the press in violation of the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment. All these actions happened in the Iranian Revolution and the Egyptian Revolution, indicating that there are a set amount of actions which can indicate that a revolution is possible. My paper originally focused just on the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, yet Egypt once again finds itself making headlines with the revolution and ousting of Mohamed Morsi. I will take a moment to go over this as well. Morsi did attempt to solidify his power by making it so that his executive actions could not be questioned by the courts. If this action had succeeded, it would have given him unchallenged power in deciding what he could do. It would not have been much trouble to influence social, political, and economic order. The Egyptian people protested against this rule, yet Morsi did not let them criticize his actions and called for an attack against protesters outside the presidential palace. By this point, 82% of Egyptians wanted the military back in power. This isn't terribly surprising because the military is the main way to enforce power in Egypt and controls 15 to 40% of Egypt's GDP, as well as controlling a major portion of the government. But to face the facts, a huge amount of young Egyptians live in poverty and are unemployed. According to the Pew Research Center, one of the top priorities of Egyptians is improving economic conditions. For the economy to grow, it needs to work on getting the younger generation back to work and help improve their situation. Yet Egypt continues to receive foreign aid from other Middle Eastern countries, which prevents necessary economic reforms from being passed. I believe it would be a mistake to rely solely on the military to pass these reforms. Their focus is primarily on enforcing laws, not economic regulations. Keeping in mind everything that I have covered, my policy suggestions are broken down into political, economic, and social actions. In terms of politics, I believe that the United States should hold our allies to a higher standard. Both Iran and Egypt were allies of the United States, yet these countries disregarded our constitutional principles, which led to revolutions which ushered in governments who were unfriendly to the United States. We can uphold these values by supporting pluralistic governments and cultures which will establish the primacy of law. Economically, not all countries are suited for pure capitalism. We must work with countries to understand and plan the best economic path forward and help them to implement that plan so that they may join the global market. Some of the animosity built up in the Middle East and the United States is due to the lack of cultural misunderstanding and the stereotypes that come with it. We should reinvest and create new exchange programs which focus not only on cultural misunderstanding and stereotypes, but also work to overcome political and economic challenges, because by working together we can overcome the greatest challenges. The enemy of the United States is not political Islam. It is the intolerance of differing viewpoints and the extremist reactions against those views. I believe that if we apply the rules laid out in Rawls' book Political Liberalism, then we can take another step toward understanding and implementing a global version of justice. Thank you.